Greg Gutfeld just obliterated Adam Schiff on live TV, and the whole thing felt like stand-up comedy set inside the Capitol building. The moment Gutfeld opened his mouth, it was game over. The man didn't just clap back. He straight up humiliated Schiff with the kind of savage style that had even congressional staffers holding back laughter. He ripped through Schiff's drama-filled speeches, wild predictions, and constant need to hog the spotlight like it was open mic night for political actors.
It all started with a spotlight that was never meant to last this long. Adam Schiff wasn't always a headline magnet or the go-to face of primetime impeachment theater. In fact, for years, he played the role of a soft-spoken Kamrashi congressman from California, man with a legal background, a calm demeanor, and a reputation for knowing how to stay out of political brawls. That all changed when Donald Trump entered the picture. The Trump presidency didn't just shake up. American politics had handed Schiff a role he never dreamed of auditioning for: resistance star-in-chief. As the ranking member, and later chairman, of the House Intelligence Committee, Schiff suddenly found himself at the center of America's most high-stakes political dramas. Cable news loved him, editorials praised his poise, and slowly, a transformation began. He stopped being a public servant and started performing like one. It was during the early days of the Russia investigation that Schiff began crafting a persona, the steady voice of reason in a chaotic Washington. His appearances on CNN and MS grew frequent. His language became more dramatic. Words like grave, alarming, and unprecedented rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. He teased secret evidence, hinted at explosive revelations, and dangled suspense like a veteran storyteller. The halls of Congress weren't enough anymore. Schiff had discovered the power of the camera and he wasn't going to let go of it. But behind the gravitas and calculated pauses, something else was happening. Schiff's rise wasn't driven by what he revealed, but by what he promised. His certainty became his currency. Even when special counsel Robert Mueller's report deflated the most dramatic allegations, Schiff didn't blink. He simply moved on to the next scene, the next crisis, the next press hit. Truth became less about facts and more about performance and the audience. Many didn't notice the Schiff tour chose not to. That's where the danger crept in, because when performance becomes indistinguishable from governance, we stop asking questions. We stop demanding results. We applaud the monologue, even when there's no substance behind it. Schiff may have started with genuine intent, but somewhere along the way, the applause got louder than the evidence. The spotlight became more important than the score. And as we moved deeper into the impeachment era, Schiff wasn't stepping back. He was stepping further into character. From carefully worded speeches to choreographed hearings, he embraced the role completely, not as a neutral investigator, but as a leading man in a political saga. He didn't just take the stage, he started directing the show. That stage would soon expand. The storyline would get bigger, messier, and far more personal. And Adam Schiff, he'd soon learn that when you live by the performance, you risk getting torn apart by the critics, especially when one of them is Greg Gutfeld. Once Adam Schiff stepped into the limelight, he needed a script big enough to keep the lights on, and the Russia collusion narrative. That became his blockbuster. Almost overnight, Schiff went from a committee chair to the unofficial narrator of America's favorite political thriller, Trump and the Kremlin. He leaned into it with everything he had. On camera, he'd furrow his brow, lower his voice, and say things like there is direct evidence of collusion or more than circumstantial. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, grave calculated, as if the very foundation of the republic hung in the balance. For months, networks gave him uninterrupted airtime to tease the idea that Donald Trump had conspired with Vladimir Putin to rig the 2016 election. Headlines echoed his warnings. Pundits nodded solemnly. Every new leak or rumor became part of the tapestry, and Schiff, he was always one step ahead, or so he claimed, but the details never quite matched the drama. Behind closed doors, in sworn testimony, even Obama-era intelligence officials admitted they saw no direct evidence of collusion. Still, Schiff pressed on. He kept promising that the next hearing, the next witness, the next batch of documents would finally connect the dots. Then came the Mueller report, a nearly 450-page document that left millions of Americans confused. No conspiracy, no sealed indictment against Trump for collusion. Just a lot of murky behavior and a media that had to quietly walk back years of hype. Yet Schiff didn't retreat, he pivoted. Obstruction, he said. Intent, he found new angles to keep the camera on him. But for many Americans, something had changed. The promised explosion had turned out to be a puff of smoke. And those who had watched Schiff lead the charge began to wonder, was this ever about truth, or just about airtime? It's one thing to be wrong. It's another to be confidently wrong on a national stage and never acknowledge it. That's where trust fractures. Because when leaders act like performers, accountability becomes optional and voters become an afterthought. Still, the show wasn't over. Schiff had another production in the works, one with higher stakes, sharper conflict, and far more airtime. And this time, he wasn't just accusing a president, he was leading the charge to remove one The impeachment saga was just beginning. By the time the impeachment hearings began, Adam Schiff wasn't just a congressman. He was the showrunner of a political spectacle broadcast live across America. C-SPAN became his stage, the House Intelligence Committee, his production set, and every witness, every question, every moment of silence was part of a carefully curated performance. Schiff understood the power of optics. He choreographed the flow of testimony like a director blocking a scene. Witnesses were coached behind closed doors. Key moments were leaked just before airtime. Camera angles were exploited to capture the furrowed brows, the long pauses, the dramatic build-ups to half-revealed facts. It wasn't just oversight, it was orchestration. Take one particular hearing. A diplomat began a dry procedural answer. Schiff cut in. "Let me rephrase," he said. He then asked a more leading question, one designed to sound explosive, even if the answer wasn't. Headlines the next day. Bombshell testimony. But if you watched the full clip, the drama fizzled by minute 3. This happened again and again. Like a television producer trying to turn a slow documentary into a must-watch drama, Schiff added suspense where there was ambiguity, emotion where there should have been clarity. The real danger wasn't the embellishment, it was the erosion of trust. Americans weren't watching a fact-finding process. They were tuning into a political play with a predetermined ending, and the audience split down the middle. For some, Schiff was the brave prosecutor defending democracy. For others, he was a political dramatist, milking fear for headlines. The tragedy wasn't in who was right or wrong, it was that the process, which should have unified Americans around truth, ended up deepening their division. Still, Schiff wasn't done. When the hearings failed to yield the knockout punch, he shifted gears again. A new strategy, a new narrative, and a new public enemy emerged. And this time, the drama moved from the committee room to the national stage. The next act would be his most ambitious yet. As Adam Schiff's dramatic hearings unfolded, the media played their part in it as neutral observers, but as eager amplifiers of every ominous pause, every vague declaration, every camera-ready moment. It wasn't reporting, it was echoing. And the louder Schiff spoke, the more the headlines rang like gospel. News outlets ran with phrases like bombshell revelations, Schiff exposes the truth, or new evidence uncovered, even when the actual substance behind the stories was thin. A clipped quote here, a dramatic headline there, and suddenly a procedural hearing became a national emergency. One example stands out. Schiff once claimed he had direct evidence of Trump-Russia collusion. Within hours, it was splashed across every major news network. Cable hosts spoke of smoking guns and imminent takedowns. But behind the scenes, that evidence never materialized, not then, not ever. The story faded, but the narrative stuck. The damage was done. This wasn't accidental. Schiff spoke in a language tailor-made for media consumption. Cryptic, emotionally charged, and conveniently open-ended. It allowed journalists to fill in the gaps with speculation that often became accepted as fact. And when doubts arose, when skeptics asked for details or context, they were dismissed as partisans or deniers. Schiff's word, boosted by the media's microphone, became truth by sheer repetition. The result was a feedback loop. Schiff supplied the drama, the media amplified it, and the public absorbed it, unaware that the volume had been turned up without consent. The deeper concern here wasn't a single flawed story, it was the normalization of performance over proof. When the Fourth Estate trades curiosity for confirmation bias, we all lose. But while the media buzzed and Schiff basked in the spotlight, there was another arena he couldn't control, the court of public perception, and in that space, comedy and criticism found a surprising champion, someone who would soon turn Schiff's carefully crafted image into a national punchline. At some point, Adam Schiff stopped living with the truth and started renting space to something much looser. Not full-on lies, not outright fiction, but something in between. A murky relationship with facts, where vague inferences and carefully phrased almost truths took the place of clarity. It wasn't lying. It was something more slippery, like a situationship with reality. Take, for instance, his repeated claim that he hadn't had contact with the whistleblower behind Trump's first impeachment. For weeks he denied any connection, but when the story unraveled, it turned out his staff had coordinated with the whistleblower's team before the complaint was ever filed. Schiff's defense: he should have been much more clear. But to many Americans, it wasn't a lack of clarity, it was a conscious omission, dressed up as plausible deniability. And this became a pattern. Schiff would make dramatic claims, having concrete proof of collusion, then backpedal when pressed. Or he'd release summaries of classified testimony that turned out to be misleading. Each time, his words danced just close enough to sound legitimate, while steering clear of anything verifiably false. It was political wordplay at its finest. This strategy gave him something powerful: deniability, without accountability. And while his supporters clung to every quote, others began to see the cracks. When truth is stretched this thin, it eventually snaps. And when that happens, the audience starts asking questions Schiff never expected. There's a lesson here about trust. Once people sense they've been misled, even by omission, it's almost impossible to rebuild the bridge. Politicians who flirt too long with the edge of truth often find themselves standing alone when the lights come back on. Still, Schiff didn't retreat. Instead, he leaned in even further, doubling down with new soundbites, new warnings, and eventually, a new stage to perform on. Because when truth couldn't carry the show anymore, the next act needed something louder, flashier and, unexpectedly, funnier. This was the chapter where shadows whispered louder than facts, and Schiff leaned all the way in. When the whistleblower complaint about Trump's call with Ukrainian President Zelensky first emerged, Schiff positioned himself as the stoic guardian of democracy, standing firm, calling for accountability, and promising that transparency would prevail. It sounded noble, it looked sharp on camera, but behind the curtain, things were murkier. Schiff told the public his committee had not been in contact with the whistleblower, but later, reports revealed his staff had been looped in well in advance. Again, he brushed it off not as deception, but as a misunderstanding. That wiggle room, the same legal gray zone he so often exploited, became his go-to tactic. And when the media questioned his portrayal of Trump's call transcript, which Schiff had famously dramatized with embellished parody language during a House hearing, he insisted it was clear satire. But for millions watching at home, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like manipulation. The difference between quoting and editorializing is a fine line, and Schiff tap danced along it with the confidence of a man who knew the audience wanted drama more than detail. Then came the wiretap rhetoric, as he hinted at clandestine surveillance and shocking discoveries, none of which ever truly materialized, but the damage was done. Each insinuation fed cable news cycles, fundraising blasts, and a broader narrative that something was definitely wrong, even if no one could pin down exactly what. This wasn't oversight, it was choreography. Carefully timed leaks, strategic outrage, hints of bombshells always just around the corner. But when the curtain lifted, there were no fireworks, just smoke and mirrors. And here lies the irony. In his zeal to expose corruption, Schiff became entangled in a system of overpromises and underdeliveries. The public didn't need perfect truth. They needed consistent truth. But instead, they got layers of performance where sincerity and strategy blurred. It's a warning to anyone holding a microphone in Washington, when every sentence is a cliffhanger. Eventually, people stop listening for the resolution, and Schiff, he still had a few more acts up his sleeve, because when the truth wears thin, there's always one last place to retreat, straight into the spotlight. After years of commanding headlines, center stage hearings, and somber warnings about democracy hanging by a thread, Adam Schiff did something many politicians do when the spotlight starts to dim. He wrote a book. It wasn't just any memoir. It read like a heroic chronicle of one man standing against the storm, filled with tales of courage, resistance, and late-night strategy sessions. The title might as well have been How I Alone Saved the Republic and Also Stayed Calm on CNN. Schiff painted himself not just as a witness to history, but as its moral compass. Then came the campaign. After being censured by the House for promoting the Trump-Russia narrative, Schiff launched his bid for the U.S. Senate. To supporters, it was a comeback. To critics, it was the final act of a man who mistook his own PR for public service. In his campaign video, Schiff stood Talsumer music swelling behind him as he claimed he was punished not for misleading the country, but for holding Trump accountable. The message was clear. I'm not the problem, I'm the martyr. He leaned hard into the victim card. Removed from the House Intelligence Committee, that wasn't a consequence, it was persecution. Accused of misleading the public, that wasn't fair, it was a right-wing smear. He didn't pivot or apologize. He reframed again and again. Yet something curious happened. The louder Schiff claimed injustice, the more skeptical the public became. Not because victimhood can't be real, but because when it's worn like armor, it starts to look less like a wound and more like a weapon. It's a pattern that plays out far too often in politics. When accountability knocks, some don't answer, they call it harassment. But here's the truth. Being held responsible isn't the same as being silenced. Being questioned isn't the same as being attacked. Schiff's book, campaign, and rallying cries weren't just about setting the record straight. They were about keeping the performance alive, shifting from prosecutor to protagonist to persecuted hero. And as the cameras rolled again, one question loomed. Was this still about truth or just about keeping the show going? Because the curtain wasn't down yet. There was one final scene waiting in the wings, and this one promised to be the loudest of them all. If Washington had a comedy club, Greg Gutfeld would have been headlining that night, and Adam Schiff was front row, center seat, without even realizing he was the punchline. It started like any other segment on The Five. Gutfeld, casual as ever, leaned in with that mischievous smirk. But this time, the target wasn't just any political figure, it was Adam Schiff. And the gloves came off fast. Gutfeld didn't rant, he didn't yell, he roasted. With surgical precision and stand-up timing, he peeled back Schiff's entire persona like it was a bad off-Broadway script. He mocked the bug-eyed urgency, the dramatic pauses that sounded like a Netflix thriller teaser. And the voice monotone, drawn out, always teetering on the edge of disaster, even if the topic was just parking tickets. Schiff, Gutfeld said, talks like a man who just realized he left the stove in the middle of a classified intel meeting. And he didn't stop there. From Schiff's obsession with camera time to his constant, theatrical warnings about democracy in peril, Gutfeld painted the congressman as a full-time performer in a never-ending audition. "This guy doesn't lie," he quipped. "He just Airbnbs falsehoods, gives them a place to stay, and maybe breakfast." The roast was funny, sure, but underneath the humor was something sharper, a deeper critique. Gutfeld wasn't just making fun of Schiff's style. He was calling out a culture where fear sells better than facts, and where performance often matters more than policy. And Schiff, he didn't respond with outrage or rebuttal. He released another dramatic video. Dark background, stern expression, a call to protect our democracy. It was almost too perfect, like he was proving Gutfeld's point in real time. But the laughter didn't just echo through Fox News, it spread. Clips went viral, memes exploded. For once, even people who weren't political junkies paid attention, and not because they cared about policy but because the show was just too hard to look away from. There's a lesson buried in that laughter. If your entire brand is built on crisis, eventually people will stop believing the sky is falling. They'll just wait for the punchline. And Schiff's punchline was still coming, because while the roast may have embarrassed him, it didn't stop him. In fact, it might have inspired his boldest move, yet an emotional final act, framed not as a retreat, but as a rallying cry, the kind that demands silence from the room, even if no one's quite sure what he's saying. Just when everyone thought the curtains had finally closed on Adam Schiff's performance, there he was again, not backstage, not heading home, but stepping right back into the spotlight with a fresh monologue, another urgent warning, and that familiar expression of this time, "It's really serious." It's not that he doesn't hear the criticism, he does. The censure vote, the relentless mockery from Gutfeld and others, the polls showing declining trust, they're all loud and clear. But Schiff doesn't walk away. He doubles down, again, and again, and again. So why does he keep coming back? Because for Adam Schiff, the stage isn't just a platform, it's an identity. He's not just playing a role in Washington. He's convinced he is the role. The crusader, the conscience, the man standing between the republic and ruin. And when someone truly believes they're the last line of defense, even the loudest boos sound like applause. It's why he launches another op-ed every time public attention starts to drift. It's why he frames criticism as martyrdom, and why each controversy becomes another battle for democracy. Schiff isn't just reacting to events, he's recasting them, shaping the narrative so that no matter what happens, he's still the moral center of the story. Take, for example, his Senate campaign. After being removed from the Intelligence Committee, most politicians might lay low, recalibrate, or at least reflect. Schiff, he launched a highly produced campaign video the next day, full of swelling music, slow-motion footage, and a speech that sounded less like policy and more like an audition for a historical biopic. Every setback was repackaged as righteous adversity. Every misstep became part of a larger mission. But here's where it gets complicated. For some, that kind of persistence is inspiring. The never-back-down energy, the refusal to be the stuff of political legend. Yet for others, it starts to feel like a never-ending loop. One man chasing headlines, not solutions. Drama, not decisions. And maybe the lesson in all this is that there's a difference between perseverance and performance. One builds trust, the other builds tension. When a leader sees every camera as a mirror and every challenge as a spotlight, the audience eventually starts to wonder, are we watching leadership or theater? As Schiff prepared for yet another speech, another TV appearance, another dramatic statement about democracy's future, the question became less about what he'd say and more about whether anyone was still listening. And in that growing silence, one final voice was preparing to speak. Not a politician, not a pundit, but a colleague who'd sat quietly long enough and was about to bring the whole room to a standstill. For years, Adam Schiff played the role of the relentless truth seeker. The spotlight followed him from the halls of Congress to primetime interviews, from Intelligence Committee chairs to dramatic press conferences. But eventually, even the most gripping performance wears thin. America didn't flip the channel all at once. It started with a sigh, then a shake of the head, then the mute button. It wasn't because the issues didn't matter. National security, impeachment, foreign interference, these are serious topics. But when every update came wrapped in suspenseful music, vague innuendo, and breathless urgency, it all began to blur. The lines between governance and entertainment, between leadership and performance, became harder to distinguish, and people grew tired. There's only so long a country can live in DEFCON 1 mode. When every disagreement is called a constitutional crisis, when every opponent is labeled a threat to the republic, the weight of that drama begins to crush even the most attentive citizens. Voters stopped tuning in, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know what to believe anymore. Take Schiff's post-censure video as an example. Dim lighting, dramatic delivery, a plea to save democracy. But after years of similar scenes, the impact wasn't the same. What once felt urgent now felt recycled. The performance hadn't changed, but the audience had. People weren't looking for another dramatic speech. They wanted results, clarity, maybe even a little honesty that didn't come, prepackaged and patriotic slogans. And that's the heart of it. America isn't asking its leaders to be perfect. It's asking them to be real, to ditch the stage and speak plainly, to address problems without turning every press conference into a trailer for the next political thriller. Because at the end of the day, a democracy doesn't need actors. It needs adults. And as the curtain slowly lowers on Adam Schiff's long-running drama, the nation finds itself yearning not for the next act, but for something quieter, truer, more grounded. A moment of calm, after years of noise. That silence is where the story now turns.